Well, hello and welcome to this very special event from the Dublin Bowie Festival. My name is Nicholas Pegg. I'm the author of a book called The Complete David Bowie, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by a man of so many parts that it's hard to know where to begin, but I shall try. Musician, songwriter, producer, radio presenter, actor, professional grumpy old man, and of course, legendary keyboard player with Yes, with his own solo projects, and in collaboration with countless other artists, among them, of course, David Bowie, which is why we're here today. So a very warm welcome to Rick Wakeman. Thank you for joining us, Rick.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's lovely to see you. And you're up in East Anglia, is that right?
I'm in Suffolk, yeah.
In Suffolk.
I'm in Suffolk, beautiful part of the world. I've been living in East Anglia now for about 15, 16 years. And recently just moved to down into Suffolk. It's absolutely a very musical area. Benjamin Britten just up the road, and very famous. I'm very close to Constable country and Gainsborough country. So it's a very sort of artistic area for poets and writers. Lots of people. Griff Rhys Jones, a neighbour. I've just got lots of. It's just a very, very artistic place to come to.
Wonderful. I'm perishing cold at this time of year, probably as well.
It's not exactly sort of bathing costume weather, no.
Yeah. I'm down in Devon, where it is actually also Brass Monkeys today.
Oh, whereabouts in Devon are you been?
Oh, I'm just near Exeter, just in the countryside, a few miles outside Exeter.
I used to live at Woodbury Salterton.
You never did. That's just down the road.
Yeah, I lived.
Really?
Yeah, the Diggers Rest is my local.
The Diggers Rest. Good heavens! Sorry, everybody. We'll talk about David Bowie in a minute, but this is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what do you know? That's extraordinary. Yeah, Woodbury Salterton's just down the road from me. Well, next time I'm in the Diggers Rest, should I ever be allowed out of my cage, I'll raise a pint to you there.
Thank you.
We ought to get on and talk about your work with David Bowie, which is what we're here for. So, your association with David Bowie began in 1969, and I think I'm right in saying it was pretty much right at the beginning of your recording career. You'd been at the Royal College of Music, is that right?
Yeah, I'd been at the Royal College, and I was doing lots of sessions at the time. I started doing sessions full time, I suppose, in 1968, doing a lot of sessions for different people. And one of the first sessions I ever did was for Denny Cordell, who was a great, great producer, and it was for a guy called Jimmy Thomas, who was actually a singer with the Ike and Tina Turner band, and he'd come over to England to do a recording, and he was bringing his band over, and I suppose the best way I can describe this is some of his band were held at Heathrow Airport for perhaps having one or two things on them that they shouldn't have had. And so he arrived and he only had half a band, and missing was an organist, keyboard player. And I had a great friend called Chaz Cronk, who was involved, who's a bass player with Strokes, and he collared me in quick, and I did the brass arrangements for them and went along and did the session, and that was at Olympic Studios in London, and also there was Tony Visconti, and Tony Denny had a label called Regal's Honophone, and two of the so-called staff producers were Tony Visconti and Gus Dudgeon. And I did the session, and cut a long story short, then he said, come up and see me at the offices, which was in Oxford Street, 68 Oxford Street. And I went up the next day, met him, and that's when I had a good talk and chat with Tony and with Gus, and started to get work from them as well as the other. You normally got sessions through fixers, but I got a lot directly through Tony and through Gus, which included people like Colin Scott, Al Stewart, the T-Rex. I mean, it was just a lot of great people. And I did an album with Tony for a band called Junior's Eyes, who are a great band. An album called Battersea Power Station, which I think has just been re-released on CD. A great album. I really thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And while I was in the studio, which was Morgan Studios in North London, in Willesden, there was a period of time where I didn't have anything to do. I just sort of sitting around. So there's no point sitting around just in the control room, listening to them trying to repair a track or whatever it was. And in the studio was a mellotron that had just arrived. They were all double mellotrons back then, and I'd seen pictures of one but never actually seen one. And I said to the engineer that, is that studio? They said, yeah, it's been brought in, but nobody can get it to stay in tune. And I said, well, I've got nothing to do for half an hour. Can I go and have a play with it? They went, yeah, help yourself. So I went in, I stuck a pair of earphones in it, and it was a Pegg. They are a Pegg to keep in tune.
Could you just explain to people who might not know exactly what a mellotron was or is still, because it was quite a sort of on-trend instrument at the time, wasn't it? Because the Beatles had famously used it in fields. Things like that. What exactly is it's to do with little bits of tape that run through or something?
It's tape loops. Basically, think of it as a load of tape recorders, a tape all in one, but just with playback. And basically, it was a loop of a note, and when you depress that note on the key, the loop would it would press itself against the playback head, and you would hear whatever it was that was recorded on that tape. And it had a very unique sound, a really unique sound. It was good, there's no doubt about it. The trouble was that because it was motorized, the more notes you pressed down, the slower the motor went. So trying to keep the thing in tune was just nigh on impossible. And it had a pitch control, and I found that there was a way of playing it using the pitch control. And the other problem was, of course, the notes only lasted for 8 seconds. And after 8 seconds, there was a big click, and it sort of all stopped. And I found a way of sort of controlling this. And Tony Visconti actually came in and said, "Well, how do you keep that in tune?" And I said, "Well, he said, no, don't tell me." He said, "And if I were you, I wouldn't tell anybody else either." He said, "You could find that very useful." I didn't think anything about it. And then we come into 1969. I was in the evenings working for a 17-piece band on the top rank circuit in England, which a lot of session guys were doing, because that was your evening work. And we were rehearsing. And I remember there was a call came through, no mobiles, they came through to the top rank office, and they came and got me, and I went in there, and they said, "Look, David Bowie's recording Space Oddity at his track at Trident Studios. He wants to have a mellotron as well as strings mixed together, but we can't keep the mellotron in tune." And Tony was around, and Tony said, I know somebody can keep it in tune. They said, "So can you get up here straight away?" And I said, "Well, I'm in Reading." And they went, "Yeah." I went, "Okay." So I jumped in the car, went up to Wardour Street, parked up, and went in. I'd never met David before. It was the first time I met him. And I walked in, and he went, "Oh, thanks for coming." I said, No problem, my pleasure." And he said, "I've been told you'll find this a piece of cake." And I went, "Ah, okay." He said, "You played a piece of cake before?" And I went, "Probably not." And he said, "Well, you will do now." So I went down, played the track, because we did it sort of live, and I did the mellotron bit on the run through, and then it was actually, to be honest with you, very easy to do what I had to do. A difficult thing was keeping it in tune, but we did the next take, and that stayed in tune, and they went, "Yeah, thank you very much, that'll do nicely." And I went up to the control room, and there were some interesting things happened in that control room, because first of all, David said to me, "I've heard some of your piano stuff, I've been playing something." I went, "Oh, okay." He said, "Would you like to do some piano for me on some other tracks?" And I said, "I'd be delighted to." So we sort of made arrangements then, and I went up for tracks like Memory of a Free Festival and Wild Eyed Boy from Free Cloud and things. But before that, there was a guy in the control room from the record company, which was Philips, because it was first released on the Philips label.
Yeah.
And there was an argument going on about stereo and mono on a single. And I'm standing, I'm 18, 19, something like that. And David said, well, once we've mixed it in stereo, it will get it up to you. And the guy went, "No, we don't want stereo." David said, "I'm mixing it, it's being mixed in stereo." And he said, "Well, singles aren't done in stereo." And David said, they will be. He said, they will be. So we're doing ours in stereo now. And he went, well, that just takes longer time and we don't have those facilities to do that. And David said, it's stereo. And he said, well, no, you'll deliver it in mono. David said, I'll deliver it in stereo or not at all. And he got quite flustered this, and he went, well, I don't know, but I'll have to talk to you. He said, David said, you can talk to who you like. This is my music, my record, and it's going to come in stereo. And trust me, within a year, they'll all be stereo. And the guy sort of like stormed out flustered. And David said, sorry about that. I went, that's all right. I really shouldn't be here, probably. He said, no, that's fine. He said, it's just, if you believe in something, you must stick by it. Don't let record company people tell you what to do. He said, if you believe in something, you do it. And I went, oh, right, okay. And I never forgot that, actually. And then I went up a little while later and I did these other tracks and things for him. And we went for a meal just up the road in Wardour Street and had a chat. And we did have a lot musically in common. I loved the fact that David just believed so heavily in what he was doing. And in fact, he was a doer. That's what I loved about him. He hated people who he called them could-haves. Hated could-haves. He said, when he said to somebody about something, they say, oh, well, I could have done that. It made his blood boil. He goes, well, why didn't you then? And it's very true, and that's what I loved about David right through to the end. I mean, sort of jokingly, I would say, if David wanted to know what it was like to wear a frogman's outfit with a ball gown over the top and walk down Oxford Street, he wouldn't think about it. He'd do it just to find out. And that's what I loved about the guy. We spoke when we both lived in Switzerland. We used to meet at a little club called the Museum Club, and I remember one day in there, he was talking about being so disillusioned with everything that was going on in the world. He said, I don't think capitalism's the answer. And I said, well, you're surely not suggesting communism's the answer. He said, only one way to find out. And as everybody knows, off he went to East Berlin and stayed there, and he came back. I remember when he got back, he called me up, because we didn't live far away, up the same mountain a bit, really. And we met down the Museum Club, and I said, well, and with an expletive, which I will not use, he said, well, that's not an answer. I went, okay. And but he did it, and he found out for himself. And interestingly enough, he produced some very interesting stuff while he was over there. So it wasn't a total waste at all. He never wasted a second. He never wasted studio time. I mean, I've said before, and I'm not saying it just because we're talking about David now, I learned more from David and the people he worked with, like Ken Scott, like Gus Dudgeon, like Tony Visconti. I learned more about how to work in a studio, how to treat other musicians, how to respect the studio and time than I did from anybody else I ever worked with. David never wasted a second in the studio. If something wasn't going well, he'd say, okay, we'll leave that, we'll move on.
Yeah.
I'll come back to it. And he said to me, it really annoyed him about some bands that would book a studio, maybe turn up for half an hour, and then all vanish. He said one day they'll regret that. Studio time is valuable.
Yeah, and he was famous throughout his career, but I'm right from early on, and you know, Tony Visconti has talked about this a great deal, that he Bowie was a great fan of Take One. If Take One was good, even if it had a few flaws, he'd far prefer that than do numerous endless takes.
Yeah, he liked feel and immediacy, and it is very true. I mean, I've learned that myself. As often or not, when I'm doing stuff on my own and we do some recordings, and I might do 2 or 3 or 4 takes of something, and my engineer Eric will say, do you want to listen to the first one you did? And I'll go, well, I thought it was a bit flawed. He went, listen. And I'd listen, and there might be a couple of a little bit. He said, that has got so much life, that's got so much immediacy, he said, let's work with that one. And that was, you're right, that was David, but that was also Tony. I did a lot of work with Tony Visconti. I have huge respect for Tony and his production, the way that he works. And if he thought he could make the best out of the first or maybe even the second take, then he would do it. And he was right every time. You know, I've done sessions over the years where we've been on take 27, and it's as tired as you like. You just plod your way through it, and you wonder what on earth the producer is trying to achieve.
Yeah, yeah. It's a great testament to. I mean, even right back then at the beginning on the Space Oddity recording, as you mentioned a moment ago, I mean, you were very young. He was very young. He's maybe a couple of years older than you. I think David was 22 at the time of the Space Oddity sessions. Stand his ground like that, and also to have that level of maturity already in the studio is quite something, isn't it? Really,
it is. But you see, I think there's a lot of things that people sometimes forget about David. I mean, obviously not people like yourself, are very knowledgeable, but David's career started, or his apprenticeship, whatever you like to call it, started way before that. You know, as indeed a folk singer. To some, you know, as David Jones, a folk singer. And one of the great things, because I was doing a lot of stuff for various folk artists, various bands like Magna Carta, obviously like the Straws and a few others, and Al Stewart. And the great thing was that their songs all told stories. They all told these great stories, and that's what they were very much. David was musically ahead of the game of a lot of them. And so musically, he could be a little more, or quite a lot more complex with the ideas and thoughts that he had. But you move that on to, you know, like one of my favorite David tracks of all time is Wild Eyed Boy from Free Cloud. Of which there is a version which Tony Visconti added an orchestra to, which is quite beautiful, and it's an interesting story. It's beautifully told, musically told, but it goes back to the folk roots. And then when you move on to the David Bowie album that came next before Hunky Dory, you can actually see that he was getting more and more into what could be done with other instruments and other ways of arranging, putting it together, but still telling the stories. And that came, of course, with Space Oddity, and then into Hunky Dory, where the story, where that storytelling, the whole thing, there is a pathway, right from David's early beginnings. This, you can see why he got there and how he got there, and it's an incredibly complex, but in a sort of simple, if you can put the two words together, way he did, because he believed in what he did. He learned and took from all the things that he did early on, and I thought that was marvelous. I loved stories. I mean, I was never a great fan of boy meets girl, girl loves boy, boy doesn't love her anymore, you know, kicks her into touch, you know, I wasn't into that. So I loved storytelling, and David did that. And I think that the Space Oddity, I remember hearing it for the first time, and I went back to the top rank ballroom in Reading, and they had a DJ there, because it used to be half band, half DJ. And I said to her, I've just played on what I think is just an incredible record. And and I told him about it. And when it came out, initially he said to me, well, I can't see them playing a lot of discos. Said, the world doesn't revolve around discos, you know, it really doesn't. I mean, it was interesting because it had controversy right from the start with the problems over in America, and it wasn't a #1 hit first time around. It was second time around it became a #1 hit, which I was very pleased about for many reasons, including the fact that it helped me win the quiz program Pointless on the telly, because that was it came up as one of the questions. And Alexander Armstrong said, how on earth did you know that it wasn't a hit second time around? I said, because I played on it. And he went, well, if we'd known that, we would never have put it in. I went, it doesn't matter, I won. Thank you. That's by the way. I just thought it was musically brilliant in every respect. All of the musicians that took part understood it. And that was something else that was important today. David said to me, you know, when I was around his house in Beckenham, he said, always pick on musicians that you know will understand what you're trying to achieve. You can take the best musicians in the world, but if they don't know what you're trying to achieve, it won't work. and he was a writer. He always seemed to pick musicians that understood what he wanted and he could work with. And I've learned from that. I've done the same ever since. I mean, going around his house and meeting Woody and Trev and obviously Mick. I mean, I met Mick before because he'd done other sessions and things with us. I mean, it was just wonderful, the whole thing. And as sort of just said, doing the David Bowie album, which was also the initial album, was released on Philips.
Yes.
And it had the most amazing cover.
Mm.
And I lost my cover in one of my many divorces, and I would I look all the time to see if I can get hold of it, because it was released in various different guises. I think RCA released it and a few others, but that Philips version of the cover, I just thought was just absolutely tremendous.
Yeah, it's very striking. So,
yeah.
Even then, that day in the studio, you could hear the song. You could. I mean, obviously, it's easy for us now to look back and say, yes, it's a classic, and we all love it. But even that day in the studio, you knew it was something special coming.
Yeah, I mean, people have said the same thing. They said, "Oh, well, you're just saying it's retrospective, looking in hindsight." I said, "No, it wasn't." I mean, you've got to remember that in those, I was doing 2, sometimes 3 sessions a day.
Yeah.
You know, over that period of time, already up till then, I'd probably done 600, 700, 800 sessions playing on different people's records. Wow. A lot of, and you knew pretty much instantly when you did say, "Hey, this is good for different reasons," and some do stick out. I mean, obviously when I did Morning Was Bright for Cat Stevens, you just knew that was going to be, very successful. Even pop songs like "Love Goes When the Rosemary Knows," or whatever is up her nose, or whatever. I remember doing that and coming out, and I said to the guys, I said, "You got a big hit on your hands there." Yeah, you could tell. And the things with Bowie, certainly Space Oddity, definitely Hunky Dory. You just want to make, that is going to be huge. I actually said to David when he first played me the songs around his house on Hunky Dory, I did actually say to him, I said, "David, this is going to outlive all of us. These are just incredible songs. Every single one of them is a winner."
He had really hit his stride as a songwriter at that point, hadn't he? I mean, not that the work before was poor; it was brilliant. But at the time of Hunky Dory, the songs seemed to be just pouring out of him, and they were
all into. And we spent quite a lot of time. I spent the whole day at his house. We left very late in the evening. I mean, his lad had just been born, and my wife at the time, number one, I don't call her number one, but my number one, she was there, and they were playing with a kid, and David and I were just talking for forever. And I asked him about his influences, and he put this album on, and he said, "I'm putting one of these tracks on the album. I'm going to do it," and he played it. And I initially thought it was David because the voice was so similar. And it was Biff Rose, of course.
Biff Rose, right? Yeah.
And he loved Biff Rose. He thought he was the most underrated songwriter performer ever. And I went out and I bought that particular Biff Rose album. And of course, Fill Your Heart went on the album. And it was interesting that Biff influenced him. I think if anything, it was because it was the way he delivered the songs. It's like telling the story. I mean, David, when he sings his songs, he sings the story. He doesn't, or the meanings of the words. Even when things moved on, he's always sang the story, whatever he was saying.
Seems to me that he was always drawn to other artists who had a sort of quirky, slightly unobvious mode of delivery. Biff Rose being, I mean, obviously Anthony Newley, people like that he also admired back in the day, and even like that. But yeah, Biff Rose was a very idiosyncratic talent. That's a very idiosyncratic album. It's a fascinating album for any Bowie fan to go and hear, because it's not just Fill Your Heart. You can hear little kind of echoes or pre-echoes on loads of the other tracks as well. You can see how much Bowie loved the album. It's called
absolutely right.
Thorn in Rose's Side, I think it's called, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah, The Thorn in Mrs. Rose's Side. Yeah, it's good. It's worth a listen for any Bowie fan, actually. It really kind of just fills in a few sort of gaps and makes you think, oh yeah, yeah, that's interesting. He obviously loved these songs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously we're going to talk a lot more about Hunky Dory. If just backtracking a little bit though, before that, just to sort of get into the context of where, because David's career was taking off in the wake of Space Oddity, so of course was yours. As you said, you were still playing quite a few sessions for other people, but you also, round about this time in early '70, you joined the Strawbs, didn't you, and did a couple of albums with them.
Yeah.
But you were still playing with David occasionally as well. I don't know if you do you have any recollection of a track called London by Tartar, which was a bit of a more obscure one? It was recorded early 1970, which you played piano on as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a few people have mentioned this. I think I don't recall much about it, to be honest. It was probably done as a throw. Sometimes you would do 2 or 3 tracks with David, and often or not, it's the same with lots of artists. Oh, I just want to run this. I want to just try this part. Yeah. I mean, I do know the story about it. I mean, I know that it was some immigrants or something leaving the country, wasn't it? And they,
yes, I think he'd heard some people, I don't know if they were maybe Jamaican, I'm not sure, but he'd heard some people saying their goodbyes at a railway station or something.
Yeah,
and that was kind of,
and that's where it came from. Yeah. And that I do recall the story of. It's more than likely, because it's quite interesting. I don't want to say no, it wasn't me, or no, I don't know, because the odds are that it was, because often or not people turn around and say, I was there, it was you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so, I believe there's sufficient paperwork to prove that you were, but no, and it's got a lovely piano part on it, which I'm sure is you. But yeah, it's an interesting one because nobody really had heard this for many years. It only got released many years later as a bonus track. It never came out, although at the time planned for a while to be the follow-up single to Space Oddity, so it could have been right up there as a, but for whatever reason David went with another track instead.
I think it definitely was. It was that period of time when you did sessions for people, and they would often throw in another track. Can we just do this one? Let's just run through this. So sort of what I call an unplanned, planned kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It was. I'm not suggesting it was done as a throwaway, but it certainly was one that maybe David wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do with it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it's 1970 going into 1971. You're working with the Strawbs, you're working with lots of other people, but as you mentioned a while ago, at some point in the spring of '71, David calls you up and invites you round to Haddon Hall in Beckenham, where he was now living, and started playing you these songs for what was going to become Hunky Dory. So what was the process? Would he play you the songs himself on his piano? Because he was starting to sort of self-taught, but he was starting to work on the piano a lot more himself at this point, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a bit of a vamper.
Yeah,
which is how a lot of the best songs are written. Because if your piano part's too complicated, it's hard to write a song. So he was a bit of a vamper, but went round to the house, which I should get my moan in now. The owners of that house should never have allowed it to be demolished. That's for certain.
It's awfully bad, isn't it?
As you know, David only rented the property. He didn't know it. It would have done marvels for Beckenham. It would have made Beckenham fortunes of money for people visiting and go. But anyway, that's by the by. I go to Beckenham every now and then. I do the piano recital thing down there, and I go to where it was, and it just angers me. But that's by the by. Yeah, so I went to the house, and he had a sort of a minstrels going up the top, and staying there at the time was also the band, Mick, Woody, and Trev, and they were rehearsing in the sort of the basement part down there, and he had a beautiful grand piano, and I was up by the grand piano. David had his battered old 12-string guitar, which he pretty much used to write everything on. And he said, I want to play you some songs. And I had some paper, manuscript paper to make notes on and things. And he said, all the albums up to now have been pretty much acoustic guitar orientated. It starts with the acoustic and then everything builds around it. He said, I want this album to be more from the piano. And I said, okay. But he said, I'll play you the songs anyway. He said, because they were mostly written on this battered old acoustic, which he always said, if it sounds good on this, it'll sound good on anything. And he started playing me the songs. And I remember him then sitting at the piano, and I made notes. Then I remember him sitting at the piano and playing changes, and the vamping changes bit. And so I made notes of all of that. And he said, oh, and then this is called Life on Mars, and he played that and sang it. And I can remember sort of leaning back, not too far because there was no back on the piano still, but leaning back, and I can remember saying, that is one of the most phenomenal songs I've ever heard. That is fantastic. And I can't remember his actual reply, but he then went, have you made some notes? I said, yeah. He played it again. He said, can you play me back now as a piano thing? And I said, how do you want me to play it? And he said, you know how I want you to play it. I said, well, I don't, that's why I'm asking you. And he said, you know how I just play it. So I played it as a sort of like a piano piece. And he said, that's how I want you to play it. And that's when going back to what I said to you earlier, that's when he said to me, whenever you pick people to play on your own records, which I'm sure will happen, make sure you pick people who understand what you want to try and achieve. And that actually gave me a lot of confidence, because I thought, well, he's got confidence in how I play his music. And that's because it's quite a responsibility performing on somebody else's music, because you can destroy something as much as you possibly can really help it. And so you want to try, if you've got that confidence that you've been given, that you somehow it does make you play different, and makes you feel, well, I could do this, and that might work really nicely. So I played it, and he said, okay, when we go into the studio, we're a week in Trident. He said, think of it like this. And I said, what's everybody else playing? He said, don't worry what everybody else is playing. He said, they can work around this quite a lot. And I went, fine, thank you. So, as I say, when we went into Trident to record, I was actually, I was feeling very confident. I was desperately looking forward to the, to the album, because I knew the songs; they were just all so good. And the musicians, I mean, Woody, Trevor, and Mick were just such great players, and they'd been rehearsing. It was it couldn't have been better prepared to go in if you'd tried, really.
Yeah. So when you were playing, for example, on Life on Mars or Quicksand or whichever of those numbers, was it the band all together, or did you put down your piano parts?
Band all together.
Yeah. So it was the whole lot of you all coming out to do
all played, and David would often are not being just a blocked off booth singing as well. So we knew that, which was important, because music has to be played around the song. That's what's important, around the voice. And David has this good knack of going in, not keeping in time, but going in and out of the time, the way they just. So it's important to play with him like that, and understand. And I suppose because of the way that we put it all together, by this time I felt that I really did have a good feeling for how David sung, and also how he wanted it to feel behind him.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And you've spoken before very eloquently about David's very idiosyncratic, his unique, really, ear as a songwriter, his unexpected way with chord changes.
Yeah.
I guess in part, I mean, this is down to the fact that he was very largely self-taught. He'd had a few saxophone lessons, and that's about the extent of his formal musical training. I mean, was it that he'd never had the rules drummed into him, so he wasn't inhibited by any sense that he had to follow the rules? So is that what it...
I think there's an element of truth in that. I think that there was a thing about David in particular, that he would do things in a way that were, you would almost say, quite normal chord progressions, and kind of, and then just as you'd relaxed, he'd hit something of which Life on Mars is a classic example. You go, where did that come from?
Yeah.
And it's it always would throw everybody when we first did it, but then it made sense because it just became the normal all the time. I mean, I'll give you an example going the other way. My big hero is Sergei Prokofiev, and Prokofiev would do things like have a massive amount of cacophony going on, you know, like in Romeo and Juliet, and you go, what on earth is this all about? And just as you're about to go, I've had enough of this, he would go into something which was incredibly melodic, you know, with like the boom, doom, dum, da, doom, da, doom, da, doom, that kind. And you go, where did that come from? And David had where did that come from about him in his music. But you're right. Sometimes formal training can make you want to do, say, keep more to the rules.
Yeah.
So in David's case, and also another thing as well, because he'd come from that folk era, they always tune their guitars differently. They often or not they would have different guitar tunings for different tunes. I mean, Strawberry did that. Dave Cousins was classic. I mean, he spent half his life retuning the guitar for pieces he was playing.
Yeah.
And that very much, I think, contributed to them maybe playing some chords that weren't the normal tuning or the normal way you would play on the frets. But it didn't matter if it worked and it was right, and it was those different things that made David a cut above the rest.
Yeah. Yeah, I think throughout Life on Mars, as you say, is the classic example, and I guess the best known song of all those wonderful songs on Hunky Dory. But you hear it throughout the album, don't you? These, as you say, very unexpected chord progressions. Even the very beginning of changes, those sort of they modulate the chord, the piano chords that begin changes before the beat comes in. You just don't know where it's going, and then suddenly this kind of poppy beat comes in, and you go, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that."
Oh yeah, I mean, David also had that good knack of, when he was writing songs, knowing what would be the right, to use a hackneyed old expression, the right backing to go with it. I can't think of any David track ever. I'm just trying to think. No, I honestly can't think off the top of my head of any David track where the lyrics and the song didn't fit the backing that was put to it.
Yeah,
that's an art. That's an art form.
Yeah, he had a really acute sense of what, and his vocal as well, his particular vocal style, he would change that to suit to serve the purpose.
And he also he was very good at picking the right producer for the products, whatever product was he was doing, because the producer, it's a lot different today, but the producer back then, his job more than anything else was to translate what the artist wanted through the engineer onto the tape, and he had a good knack of doing that. And also, it's interesting to note that certainly when I worked with David in the early, all of the producers he used were first-class engineers and started as engineers, so they knew the desk, and they knew there was a sort of they were a catalytic person that had respect for what was going on in the live room and also what was going on in the control room. And I think that gave David a lot of confidence. Certainly gave all of us as musicians a lot of confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ken Scott, who you and I are going to be talking to in another discussion, was of course already a seasoned engineer. He'd worked with the Beatles, for goodness sake, and he'd worked on David's previous couple of albums.
Yeah, and I'd worked a lot. I'd worked a lot with Ken as well, a lot.
Yeah. So he was, and I believe, we'll talk to Ken about this, but I believe Hunky Dory was actually his first gig as producer. So it was David who gave him that little push.
It was the next stage.
Yeah.
It was the next stage.
Yeah. I mean, which is another feature that so many of David's collaborators have spoken about over the years, is his extraordinary generosity. That if he believed in someone's talent, he stood back and went, "There you go. There's the chair, or there's the mic, there's the whatever. Go for it. It's your turn to do this." As you said, the way he handed his songs over to you, confident in the knowledge that your work was going to embellish and improve them and give them what he wanted them, what he needed them to have.
Yeah.
Because
Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say, David, as you said, you know, he was dabbling on the piano. He would never have claimed that he was a virtuoso on the keyboard, but he was trying his hand at it. And so, something I did want to just ask you about Hunky Dory is that, as revealed on the sleeve notes, in fact, that David wrote, you know, handwritten on the back, he mentions that he does play. In fact, I have it right here. I've got the back of the album here. What does he say? He says, I played some guitar, the saxophones, and the less complicated piano parts, brackets, inability. That's what he's put there. Now, which is very, very honest of him. So I just wanted to ask, because Bowie fans through the ages have pondered this. I've always assumed that it's, what he's talking about there is maybe "Oh, You Pretty Things." Was that David on the piano, or is that you kind of doing it a little more simple, sort of to suit the song?
No, he did the beginning bits where he was singing along.
Yeah.
And that I can lay a bit of claim to, because I played it initially because I knew it was. But Dave was singing it, and I actually said to David, you know, the only way you're going to get the piano and your voice as you want it in sync, as you sing it, is if you actually play that bit, because otherwise you'll be either trying to sing to what I do, or I'll be trying to catch up or slow down to whatever you're doing.
So you're talking about the verse bit, which is almost quite a sort of, almost like a sort of recitative anyway.
Yeah, that's it. So David did that, and then I jumped on the piano and did the other bits.
Right. So when it gets to the chorus and it's much more sort of stompy, that's you taking over on.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there we are. Well, that settles that little mystery. So it was very much a collaboration between the two then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And another thing that you did in the Hunky Dory sessions, which waited until the next album to actually appear, was the track "It Ain't Easy," which ended up not being released until Ziggy Stardust. That was where it found its home.
Right.
But there's a lovely harpsichord on that, which you're playing for that one.
Yeah. I mean, I did enjoy doing that, and I was glad that it ended up on the Ziggy album, because it's a good track. It's a very good track, and in a strange way, if you listen to it, you have to ask yourself, would it have fitted on Hunky Dory?
Yeah, I agree. It feels much more of a piece with Ziggy, although it's a slightly odd man out even on that album. But on Hunky Dory, it's much heavier feel to it.
It's almost somewhere in between.
Yeah,
if there'd been an album in between Hunky Dory and Ziggy, that would have been on it.
Yeah. He's very much going for the kind of Ziggy vocal there, isn't it? He's got that kind of slightly more manic delivery.
He was going for the new onstage persona. There was no doubt about that.
Yeah. And so I'm assuming that was an actual harpsichord, a real one, or was it it was a bit too early for synthesizers and things at that point, was it?
If I recall correctly, it was a real harpsichord. I mean, we are talking a long time ago.
Yeah.
If I recall correctly, it was a real harpsichord, and I think we brought it in and rented it from undoubtedly the finest English harpsichord maker of all time, Thomas Goff, who I knew, who I'd met at the Royal College of Music, and had the most beautiful recording harpsichords. And I'm nearly every harpsichord session that I did, I brought a Thomas Goff in. So I've got no reason to think that this wouldn't be a Thomas Goff. But it's hard sometimes, because after close on 50 years, the mind does play a few tricks here and there. Mind it played tricks on me after 10 years, let alone 50 odd years. But it would only have been, there were no good synthesized harpsichord at the time, so it would have been
and again, a great example of a quite unexpected sound. If you'd heard that song and thought, what does this need, it takes a certain kind of ear to go, I know what this needs. It needs a harpsichord, and it sounded great, perfect for the song.
It worked really well. And I think because of the overall success of Ziggy and the overall success of Hunky Dory, it's a song that slightly got pushed to one side a bit over the years. Which is a shame, because it is an interesting song, certainly in the musical life of David. Yeah,
absolutely. So in the sort of mid to late summer of 71. The Hunky Dory sessions were coming towards an end, sort of early August, I think we're talking about. And at around this time, you had to face a bit of a crossroads, didn't you? Because practically, I don't know, in the same week, even in the same day or something, David asked you if you'd like to stay on and work on the next album, but you at the same time got another offer from elsewhere. Would you like to just fill us in on that?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I was theoretically still with Straubs, but Straubs had started to go down the poppy route, you know, and which we did an album called From the Witchwood, which had some beautiful tracks on it, but also had some what I call real pop songs on it, which that wasn't the route that I was keen on going down, and because Straubs was sort of an electronic folk prog band in its own little way, and I loved it, what it was doing. In fact, it's almost what it's returned to now. So I decided I wasn't going to continue, and I was looking to go back into sessions, and then to cut a bit of a long story short, Yes had come back from their first tour of America, where they'd supported. I'll try to remember her in a minute. I'll remember in a bit. But anyway, I got a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning from Chris Squire, which once you got to know Chris, realised that was any time he was awake. And he called me and said they were thinking of having a bit of a change in the band, and they wanted to go more down the classical prog rock route. And they'd read a couple of articles I did, and they'd seen me play with Straubs, and I'd seen them, because Straubs we supported Yes on a couple of occasions, and would I be interested in joining, because they felt that it was a good match. And I remember saying, well, I don't know, yeah, I'm not sure. They said, well, look, come along to a rehearsal. And then so I went to a rehearsal, which was in Mayfair in London, which was in a room above a brothel in Shepherd's Market, middle of the summer, and being very naive at the time, I couldn't understand why all these women in fur coats were walking around in the heat, and also why the crew kept disappearing for hours on end. But it was great working with and on the first couple of days, we knocked off tracks like Heart of the Sunrise and Roundabout, whatever, and I was really enjoying myself. And I think, oh, this is really working. And I used to drop Steve Howe home at his flat in Hampstead, because he couldn't drive at the time. And it came to one afternoon, and I'd got a phone call. I can't remember how I got the phone call, because obviously no mobiles back then. But it might have been from home before I left. It was from David, who said, would I meet him? I think it was at the Hampstead Country Club or something, or Hampstead Club, where he and Mick were going to do a duo thing. And would I come along, because he wanted to have a chat. I said, yeah, okay, fine. So I finished the Yes rehearsals, and that's when the lads, they said to me, look, do you want to join full time? Come into the band. I think so, yeah. And left it at that, and then drove off to meet David and Mick at this club in Hampstead, and we sat down, and they were doing a sort of a duo thing. And interestingly enough, Mick remembers that I got up and played. I played a couple of the songs with him. So when people say to me, you never got to play with David live, I go, yes, I did, actually. Anyway, we sat down, and David said, look, I'm putting the band together, Ziggy band, Ziggy Star, Spiders from Mars, and I want you and Mick to really be a major part of putting the band together in all that. And I went, wow, okay. And I can remember thinking, David truly was my idol. This is the guy I've enjoyed working with more than anything else, and love his music to death. And I went, I said, this is a bit weird. And he said, why is that? And I said, well, literally a couple of hours ago, I was asked to join Yes. And he went, well, go and have a think about it and call me. And I went, yeah, okay. Now the interesting thing was that David was even then much bigger than Yes was. Yes was just really starting to build up. But the difference was, when I really sat down and analysed it in a brutal manner, was what's going to be best for my career.
Mm.
And the thing was, with David, whilst I would have a lot of freedom when I played, and I know I would have had a wonderful time and loved Mick and Trevor and Woody and that, it would all be David's music, which is absolutely fine because his stuff's fantastic. But it means that there's a ceiling as to how far of where your input can be.
Yeah.
As regards to me, whereas with Yes, which were a growing prog band, I would be able to have much more influence on the songs, the writing, production, and all of the things. So even though they weren't anywhere near as big as David at the time, the opportunities to develop musically were stronger.
Yes.
And so I called David up and told him and spoke to him. I said, this is probably the hardest decision in my life I'll ever have to make. And I said, and I explained the reason. He said, well, I think you're absolutely right. And interestingly enough, years later, when we both ended up in Switzerland together and meeting at the museum club quite often as we did, it was a few years down the line after he'd started changing the band about, because he did that once he picking musicians that were right for whatever it was he was doing. Yeah. And it came up in the conversation. He said, you did absolutely the right thing. He said, as you know, he said, I changed musicians according to the music. He said, so if you'd have come in the band, he said, there's a fair chance now you wouldn't be in it. And I went, that's a good point. He said, you made absolutely the right decision all round. And so I always, when I'm asked that question about, do I ever regret doing it? The answer is no, I don't regret doing it, making the decision I did, because the man himself told me it was the right one.
Yeah, yeah. And it's fascinating to speculate, isn't it, that if you know, in that kind of sliding doors way, if you had made the other decision, the Ziggy Stardust album would have had your piano playing on it, which would have made it a very different sounding album from, because Mick Ronson actually played the piano in the end on tracks like Lady Star and beautifully, but he was it's fair to say a slightly less sort of, what's the word, a slightly less ornate piano player than you, perhaps. And
yeah,
brings a slightly different, well, a very different sensibility to it. And then, of course, on tour, Mick was busy on guitar. And so a little bit later on in 72, David was recruiting new piano players. And that's when Mike Garson came on.
Mike came in, yeah.
A totally different piano player again. So had you said yes and stayed on, had you said no to Yes and yes to David, the whole sound of David's work might have been radically different over the next year or so. It
can well have been, because Mike brought in a sort of a jazz element. Mike got a jazz element to David, which had not really been there before. But it worked. Everything works out. It's very hard to try and. You're quite right. It would have been different. But I could also equally say, would Ziggy have been as refreshing if it had been all the same band that had been on Hunky Dory?
Yeah, because it's a slightly different, in a way, it sort of cleans out the house and starts again with a slightly different.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it all worked out very well. You could all argue the same about Yes. If that hadn't changed, what would have happened there? I mean, it's very hard to speculate. I think that the only thing you can say is it all worked out rather nicely.
It certainly did. And of course, you didn't hang about at that point, did you? I mean, the first album you did with Yes, Fragile, I think was out before Hunky Dory came out. It came out before the end of about November that year, I think. And Hunky Dory was out about a month later.
You could well be right. We were out on tour in America when it came out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were very busy with Yes. And then your solo album, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, you were working on that by the beginning of 72, weren't you? While David was still.
Yeah, I was working on that in 70. Well, I started working on it at the end of 71.
Yeah.
Just on any spare bit of time that I had, and it came out in 73. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a great time for being able to well, to do things. I mean, you could go to your management of the record company and say, I want to do this. And they go, yeah, well, go on then. And I wanted to go and do, which was great. And it was following on from one of David's great lessons: be a doer. You know, no,
Yeah,
maybe I could do an album. Don't think maybe I could do an album. Do it if you
yeah,
want.
yeah,
He always said like succeed or fall by your own making.
yeah,
You know, he said to him, I remember him, we were talking once in the museum. He said, you know, sometimes record company executives will try and force you to do something, and then if you might not want to do, and then when it doesn't work, they blame you. He said, whereas if it's you do something and it doesn't work, then you can say, well, okay, well, I believed it was right, but it doesn't work, and vice versa. He said, if you do something that is wonderfully successful, they'll take the credit for it.
of course.
And he was so right. He was so right. And he said, "I'll just live with it. It doesn't matter. You wrote it. It's yours."
Yeah, yeah. It's your name on the
Your
the
name. Yeah. And he was
yeah.
brilliant with that.
Yeah. So both you and David, in your own ways, although you had sort of parted company professionally through the 70s and into the 80s, both of you doing extraordinary things all around the world. But then there's a little coda, because you did come back together again in 1985 when David invited you back to lay down what I have to say is a exquisitely beautiful piano piece on his great track Absolute Beginners. How did that come about?
It was a phone call that came through my management at the time. They said, "We've had David Bowie on the phone." And I went, "Oh yeah, great." And they said, "Do you want to call him? He wants you to call him." So I called him up on the number he'd left, and he said, "Oh, I've done the film music Absolute Beginners." He said, and that basically the title track. He said, it needs something, and he said, I think what it needs is a sort of a Rachmaninoff style piano. And I went, okay. And he said, fancy coming along for a bit of old time's sake? I said, I'd love to. And he was in the studio in London, in Latimer Road, down near Ladbroke Grove. I can't remember exactly where, but I remember it well. And I arrived there, and David was in the studio, and he said, not quite ready for you yet. Should we go around the pub? So we went round the pub, and it was quite weird because David, such a familiar face, and it doesn't matter who you are, you recognise. And we walked into the pub, and it was a real mixture of people, everything from the Steptoes and Sons of This World to lovely West Indian families, and they just all glared at David, and you could read their minds. They're going, "No, it can't be," and no, it's not him. And so David and I, we got a drink, we sat down, and we must have talked for 2 hours, reminiscing about times and things and music and Switzerland and museum club and everything that we kept on about. And in the end, he said, we better go back and do this. So we went back to the studio, and he said, before I play you the track, he got out the old battered 12-string guitar. And, oh, you haven't still got this, have you? He said, absolutely. And he played it through, and I played the track through. Excuse the noise in the background. That's the builders coming down the stairs.
We'll keep it in the spirit of experimentation. It's just a little, yeah.
Yeah, they're in a different part of the house. We don't mix in the self-isolation. They're a different part of the house, but they have to come down the stairs every now and then. Anyway, so he played me on the battered old 12-string, and then he played me the track, and said, well, there's certain spots where it definitely needs it, and other spots where you want. So I went in, bit of manuscript paper, made a couple of notes, played through the track, didn't probably play. Well, in fact, I did. I said, look, I'll play on more than I think you'll need, because it's easier to take away than just to go, oh, could have done with something there. So I did quite a bit of the piano. Thoroughly enjoyed doing it. Didn't take long, half an hour at most, and we went back round the pub, and then talked again for another hour or so, and it was a wonderful day. I really enjoyed doing that, very, very much indeed. And musically, I never got asked to do anything with him again, but I did see him again. He came to the Isle of Man to do a film when I was living Isle of Man, and I went to see him on one of the shoots. But it was a very, very brief hello because he was busy doing the filming thing, and and that was it. And often or not, after that, we would have messages come flying. Somebody who was working with him in New York or seeing you and say, "Oh, David wished to be remembered to you if I saw you." And I go, "Oh, do likewise if you see Dave."
Yeah.
So in a strange way, there was always a nice connection. I always felt that I'd seen him the week before.
Yeah.
And in all the ways that I work in the studio and all the things I do, he has been such an influence that he's always around me, whatever it is that I do.
That's an absolutely wonderful sentiment. And I can't think of a finer note on which to end for this particular discussion. So for all your memories and for all your wonderful stories, thank you so much, Rick. We're going to talk again, of course, with Ken Scott in another session. We're going to talk particularly concentrating on the making of Hunky Dory. But for the time being, Rick Wakeman, thank you so much for sharing your memories of David Bowie with us.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Dublin. Bye-bye, everybody.